But while Islam is mostly egalitarian, Hinduism was not, but nevertheless the Islamic people found that since the people they conquered were so into caste, forming a caste system among the conquered peoples just seemed to be just a natural thing for Islam to do. So Islam somewhat adopted the caste system, and the caste system remained intact, as did the practice of sati, the practice where the Hindu women, when their husbands died, they throw themselves on a fire and burn themselves to death. This practice was to continue until the British conquered India, and the British finally persuaded the people of India, hey, we consider this practice barbaric, and we want you to stop it. The Muslims did nothing to curtail the practice. They allowed it to go on. As was the case of all these ancient societies, agriculture was a big thing among them. And again, because they didn't have tractors or combines or reapers, at least 90% of the people had to engage in farming in order to feed the rest of them. They did have some trade. Actually, they had quite a bit of trade. Trade went on with Africa, as I've already mentioned, and with the Far East. Again, the winds in this part of the world are favorable. For 6 months they blow one way, for 6 months they blow another. And it makes it easy for a captain to plan when to take off, when to stay put. In the field of science, these people did make some advances in medicines. I mean, if you keep working with medicine, you might find that certain types of herbs work for certain individuals. In astronomy, the Hindu people long knew that the earth was round. The idea that people believed for generations the earth was flat, folks, this is pure mythology. In Columbus' day, every educated person knew the earth was round. Same thing for Galileo's day, everybody knew the earth was round. The issue was how big is the earth. But it took just a little bit of observation of the stars to realize, hey, the earth surely has to be round. Hindu art, your book shows an example on page 57. They featured a lot of humans with 4 arms, two arms on one side and 2 on the other. Again, this art would appear vulgar to a lot of Muslim taste. All right, so much for the time being for India. I do want to move on to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is one of the most diverse regions on the planet. It appears that the people living here, and now Southeast Asia, I'm talking about the mainland, which consists of what is today Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. At one time, Myanmar was called Cambodia. And then the Malay Peninsula, and then these East Indies islands that are today called Indonesia, as well as the Philippines. This region attracted people from China, Vietnam, possibly Korea, Japan, and from India, and of course from this part of the mainland here, and we don't know where all else. As far as we can tell, the first settlers we know anything about came around 1500 BCE. They came in waves. The next wave we know about came about 1,000 years later. And diversity, folk, a melting pot of it can be the greatest boon to a people, except, all right, well, I can't help but compare it to the United States. The United States, we had a diverse population. Europeans, Africans, Asians, Native Americans, all blending in to form a culture. But in general, we all spoke the same language, with some exceptions. We spoke English. These people had more than 1,000 languages and dialects that were so diverse that without training they couldn't understand each other. And they also were separated not just by language, but by water. And even on the land, the mountains were really tall and rugged, and on the tops of the mountains they were just like straight up and down, made for walls. And the people, when they moved in the valleys between the mountains, and nobody could unite them. Personally, I doubt that even Alexander the Great could have united all these people, so they never were united. Now, Indonesia was eventually united into one country. The Philippines were united, but the Philippines and Indonesia and the mainland have always been separate nations. And what separates these nations on the mainland, what separates Vietnam from Laos, and what separates Laos from Thailand is, again, mountains that make it difficult to cross from one to another and makes it almost impossible for a conquering army. Again, I'm not sure that Genghis Khan could have united these people if he'd have come down here, or could Alexander the Great. These people are separated by geography and separated by language barriers. So they have not been able to unite themselves. Rice, spices were some of their main crops. Rice paddies. The growing season, the weather is highly predictable. And here in the tropics, they have a year-round growing season. Now, there is one problem with tropical farming, though, and that's something we have not yet solved even in modern times. There's all kinds of diseases that hit plants, fungus diseases that we still don't know how to completely cure and treat. So that can make for farming a little bit iffy, but otherwise the growing season was predictable, the rainy season was predictable, and you could plant 2 or 3 crops a year if conditions were favorable, that is, and expect to reap most of what you harvested. Spices, a lot of these spices found their way eventually into Europe. These people, like I say, could not unite themselves, but eventually they were united by foreigners. The Dutch conquered Indonesia for a while. The French conquered this region and called it Indochina. The British conquered India. The Spanish conquered the Philippines. You'll learn all this in a second, but don't worry about it now. Then the United States wound up taking the Philippines. So between the British, French, United States, and Spanish, and Dutch, these people wound up being conquered a lot by the Europeans. Religion. As I mentioned last time, I believe, their religion started off being animism, as is the religion of a lot of what we call primitive peoples. And folk, it just seems to me that religion does determine how far a society gets. Some religions just lend themselves to making the people primitive, and animism. Again, I wonder, is it their primitiveness that makes them animistic, or is it the animism that makes them primitive? Again, that's the topic for debate. But as they became more civilized, they began to adopt Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism made a lot of headway, so did Buddhism. Somehow Confucius did not do well among these people here. Eventually, Buddhism won out. And these people became primarily Buddhists, and that was true of the Koreans, Filipinos, the Indonesians, Vietnamese. In Vietnam now, they were influenced only by China, as we'll talk about later. But Buddhism made a lot of headway until Islam came in. And Buddhism has had a difficult time withstanding Islam. And this is even true in 2014. Part of it's because Islam is a whole lot more aggressive in converting, and Buddhism is a lot more passive.
So what's animism again, besides just a primitive religion?
Say again?
What is animism?
Animism is a worship of nature, nature spirits. The belief that the sun is a god, the plants are God, the trees are God, the river is God, everything is God. And you even perform a rite called an apology before you kill an animal. If you have to kill an animal, you perform a rite called an apology. If you have to cut down a tree, you perform another religious rite called an apology. Animism is often associated with shamanism or practice of witch doctors. somewhat, again, these religions are often associated with primitive peoples, and it's known that the higher up people, when the Indian traders came, followed by Hindu and Buddhist missionaries, these people realized that the Indian civilization was higher than theirs, and they tended to want to copy it. All right. Now your book shows a picture of rice paddies. And a lot of these rice paddies, they would grow rice, and at the same time they'd grow koi. Any of you familiar with koi fish? The type of fish that can grow up to 2 feet long. When it gets to a certain size, you can eat them. So they'd grow the koi in the rice paddies, and harvest both the koi and the rice when the time came. You can buy koi at any pet shop. Hey, listen, I'm hearing talking that I should not be. I was hoping it would die down, but I just have to say something about it. All right. Your book talks again about women. The women in this part of the world tended to have what you call an enhanced status. In other words, they're more equal to the men than they were in places like India and China. And your book says that might be because the nuclear family is more prevalent than it was in places like India and China. The nuclear family is more prevalent here in this region. Women and men both could divorce. The women had a right to divorce their husbands, and the men had a right to divorce. And this was true throughout a whole lot of this region, including Vietnam, Laos, this region. They allowed the women to divorce their husbands. The men could divorce their wives. Again, your book talks about religious beliefs, the world of spirits, which is what animism is about. Spirit worship of everything, worship of nature. Which takes us up to Angkor. Almost 30 years ago, a friend of mine at Lockheed loaned me a National Geographic magazine where the whole magazine was devoted to the city of Angkor Wat. In effect, Europeans coming to this region of Thailand and Cambodia, or today Myanmar, they had heard that deep, deep inside the jungle there was a one-time glistening city. Nobody knew whether to believe it or not. And one day some European explorer was going through the jungle, came to an opening, and there in front of him was a huge, huge city that was uninhabited. A 6-foot-long black snake slithered across the street, which he ignored. A tiger peeked its head out of a window to look at him, stared at him for a little bit, then the tiger vanished back inside the building. This explorer went back to his base and told the other Europeans what he'd seen, and they came out. And there it was, this glistening city. And they began to wonder, well, who built the city? Why was it abandoned? Eventually they learned from the local natives that this was the city of Angkor Wat, that it had been built about 1,000 years before, and it had been abandoned 400 years before this time, or in other words, about 500 years ago. Now, folk, in the case of Angkor Wat, you have what you would call typically you have a case where they have a civilized people surrounded by a bunch of barbarians, and the civilized and the barbarians fight and fight and fight continually. The barbarians just simply, their numbers never seem to end. The civilized people have to spend a lot of their hard-earned money and wealth fighting them. The barbarians, I mean, it's a matter of just an easy, easy fight, no money involved. And folk, again, in the long run, the barbarians simply win. They wear down the civilized people, and after a while, the civilized people move out. Now, in the case of Angkor, and folks, what I'm about to tell you is something the National Geographic article 30 years ago said that I'm not going to make, that your book doesn't say, but I'm going to repeat. The first kings of Angkor were known to be Hindu. Hinduism made them energetic, go get them, made them conquerors, made them wealthy. Then later the kings adopted Buddhism, and again, hopefully no offense to anyone's religion, but Buddhism tends to say, accept life as it is, just be, it tends to make them passive. The Buddhist kings then became passive, and when things started to go wrong, they thought, well, everything will all work out in the long run anyway, just accept life for what it is. Don't try to change it, don't try to alter it. And they became passive. As a result, the local uncivilized neighbors of theirs got the upper hand, and eventually the city was abandoned. And it would stay in the jungle for 400 years. It's still there. Some of the buildings are intact. Some of them are deemed unsafe for you to enter, and they're afraid it will fall down. But in some cases, the temples, I do have a video that I've had for years. I used to show it, but now, because I don't have the time I once had, but about Angkor Wat, how that they had all the trappings of civilization, including a soft, easy life that often goes along with civilization. Your book shows the giant heads on Easter Island, and you'll see these from time to time. I think one of the heads, if not mistaken, toppled over recently, and folk who built them, how they were built, this remains a mystery, one of the many mysteries of the ancient world. Some of these sculptures appear to have been constructed by people who are far more advanced than we'd be led to believe. Fine. Before I leave the chapter, there's one thing I must say that I forgot to mention. I'm sorry about that. But in the conflict between Hinduism and Buddhism in India, Buddhism, as I mentioned last time, started out winning, but they wound up losing in India, and India gradually and slowly became Hindu again. Now, one of the reasons is that Hinduism decided to adapt. And folks, this is similar to the conflicts that occurred in a lot of places. In Europe, there was initially a conflict between paganism and Christianity, in which the lesser religion, Christianity, eventually came out on top. In India, there was a conflict between Hinduism and Buddhism, in which for a while Hinduism was losing, but it wound up on top. In China, there was a conflict, we'll talk about in a few minutes, between Taoism and Confucianism, and Buddhism also, with Buddhism and Taoism on one side, Confucianism on the other, with Buddhism initially seeming to win, but Confucianism coming out on top. One thing that the Hindus did was they eventually decided to include all the castes in their ceremonies. And this is believed to have been one of the main things that got the Hindu people back, got the people of India back into Hinduism. Buddhism had been more egalitarian, but then the people of India, their mindset is just simply, their mind is not egalitarian. They class some people as being above them and some as below them. They'll look around their neighborhood and say, well, this person, yeah, he's above me, and that person's below me. And their mindset is simply not egalitarian. And Hinduism is more in conformity with this. Buddhism also denies the existence of the soul. Humans have no soul. So in the long run, Buddhism underwent some theological struggles that remind me somewhat of the struggles Christianity underwent. For instance, some Buddhism split into several camps, but one camp said that you have to go through you have to live the life. One camp said live the life. Another camp said, no, just go through the rituals. This reminds me of the conflict in Christianity between faith and works. Some people who say you have to do good works. Some people say it just takes it's a matter of faith only. Buddhism went through the same type of transformation, but eventually, in the course of the conflict, Buddhism lost. The coming of Islam did not help Buddhism in the least. Somehow, Islamic people seem to make more of an impression on Buddhists than they do Hindu. Be that as it may, Buddhism fell to the background. Hinduism took the top space in India. All right. Anybody have any comments, questions on chapter 9?